All right, we're going to now cover the second part of session 2, which is on financial analysis. So module 3 on accounting showed us the process of recording transactions, getting to a financial statement. Now we're going to be the users of financial statements. And as I mentioned, this is the main takeaways of our course is if you got financials, can you make some sense out of it? Can you evaluate it and make judgments about how the company's doing? So in this particular chapter, what we're going to do is learn ratios, then compute ratios, and then interpret ratios, both in general and also specifically with examples. So this is a pretty good chapter, hopefully, for your preparation for your team project. All right, so the comic strip here is this year we're in really great shape. Nobody understands our financial statements. I think that's maybe funny, but also maybe true. That a lot of people do not understand financial statements generally, plus they're getting very complicated now as companies become more complex and accounting rules likely become more complex. We have many learning objectives here because we're going to look at a bunch of tools that can help us analyze financial statements. And I've organized them a little differently than the book, and I think it might be easier to follow if we break it into two big chunks. The first chunk is what I'll call traditional ratio analysis, and these have been employed for many, many years. And they look at company information pretty much as a whole. The items on the right represent the author's more refined analysis, looking at operating aspects as opposed to total. So it looks what the company does for a living as opposed to other activities and other assets and liabilities that they may have gathered along the way. And Intel is a good example for this particular distinction. Under traditional ratio analysis, we'll look at return on equity, and then we'll disaggregate based on the DuPont formula, which breaks it into return on asset and financial leverage components. Then we'll look at the disaggregation further of ROA. You take return on assets and then further break it down into profitability and productivity. We've done this in our first class just as an illustration, if you recall. The fourth is measures of liquidity and solvency, and they are different measures at how well the company is paying its bills and doesn't have too much debt, not enough debt, etc. And finally, in the traditional section, we'll look at two transformations of financial statements that help us quite a bit in analyzing. And we call it common sizing, or the book calls it horizontal and vertical analysis. And we'll look at it, and it sounds complicated, but it actually is not hard to do and provides some pretty powerful insights without a lot of brain headache. Under the operating components, we're going to start with looking at the balance sheet and now strip out the non-operating aspects of the assets and the liabilities in order to get to a net operating asset number. And then we'll do the same to the income statement. Look at all the aspects of income and expense, and again strip out the ones that relate to operating business so we can further analyze the success of the company in running its business as a business. Then we'll utilize some combinations to get return measures, return on net operating assets, and also the disaggregation into the profit margin and turnover. So very similar in concept to the traditional, but you'll see that it gives us better insight into how well the company is running their business as a business. So first we'll jump in and do learning objective number 1, which is ROE, namely return on assets. And as I mentioned, return is the numerator, on is divided by assets is the bottom. And here the return is measured by net income, and the assets is measured by average stockholders' equity. And notice that we use averages, and I mentioned this in class, but it bears repeating that in this book, and for our purposes of our exams, etc., we'll utilize balance sheet measures which are averages, and you'll see them in the formula, so you don't have to memorize it. Just remember to take the beginning of the year plus the ending of the year divided by 2. It's not particularly hard, but it's a little bit more than simply taking the end of year numbers. ROE measures the return from the perspective of the shareholders. Specifically, for every dollar of shareholders' equity, how much money do you make? And this is obviously important to owners if the company is doing well with the owner's money. The example in this chapter is usually Intel, and for good reason. It's an interesting company from the standpoint of analysis of profitability and rates of return. So let's start with the ROE. So Intel's ROE is 19.53. which means for every dollar of equity, Intel earns about 20 cents, which is very healthy. That's a very high margin, comparatively speaking. It's not unusual for some companies, say a Safeway, in a very tough retail business, to have single digits. But sales here are 55 billion, net income is 11, total assets 103, and total shareholders' equity of 61. So ROE is net income divided by the average of shareholders' equity. So it's the 61 for this year, the end of year. And the beginning of this year, or 2015, is equal to the end of last year. So New Year's Eve is very similar to the following New Year's Day. And that's what we do here. So the average is 2015 plus 2014 divided by 2. This particular analysis is not particularly hard, and yet it yields insight that Intel is very profitable and quantifies it. So now we're going to start disaggregating. Here we look at the two general methods as mentioned right in the beginning of this session, where we want to know more about where does a company make its money. And the two ways we can go deeper is a traditional way where we'll go DuPont and related types of ratios, or we'll look at an operating focus. And this is the premise of the chapter, is to show us two ways, a simpler way and a more complex but more insightful way. So DuPont, or traditional method, is to break out into the components that ROE equals return on assets times financial leverage. As we mentioned in the book, it looks like just an algebraic transformation. You take net income divided by shareholders' equity, that's ROE, right? And then we break it apart. You take the numerator on the left side, and it's net income, but instead of dividing by equity, we divide by assets. And then the next one, we take the denominator, or average shareholders' equity, and keep that as a denominator, and the numerator is the same as the one we just used, the addition of the average total assets. And so we see that we could just cancel out average total assets on both sides and end up with net income divided by shareholders' equity. So why do we do this? We do this because each of the components of the disaggregation is valuable. ROE shows the combination of company performance in terms of return on assets. For every dollar of assets, how much money does it make? So that's really a performance measure. And the other is a measure of leverage. For every dollar of equity, how much total assets do we have? Think of number one, right? The number one for the leverage would mean that the equity equals total assets. If that's true, then it has zero debt, right? If the numerator is total assets and is exactly equal to equity, that means there are zero liabilities. Back to our handy accounting equation. So this is valuable because it starts to dissect between how the company operates and how the company leverages itself. And how do you increase ROE? Well, we simply look at the two factors, and one is you could become more profitable, easier said than done. And the second is to increase leverage, and that increases risk, but it puts more of bank money, or what we call OPM, or other people's money, at work for your benefit. So the first factor is ROA. So ROA is the overall profitability, and the numerator and the denominator here we can look at how do we increase ROA. Well, we can make the numerator bigger, which is increased profits, or make the denominator smaller by doing it on less assets. So that's sometimes what we call lean and mean. If you make a certain amount of money and you have a lot of assets, that's not particularly impressive. If you had $10 million of profit, you say, wow, that's impressive, $10 million of profit. But if it took you $100 million to do it in asset investment, that's 10%. That's pretty good, but not quite as impressive sounding as I made $10 million. So let's compare it to if you had $10 million profit, but you put in $1 billion. Well, now you're not doing well at all, because 10 million divided by a billion is only 1%. So you see that an ROA measure is much more valuable than simply a number like how much profit did you make. It says how many resources did it take to make that profit. So that's ROA. That's very powerful, and it's pretty easy to understand. R is profits, A is assets, and the measure tells us how productive we are. Given a certain dollar of assets, how much money do we make? So the second is leverage, and again, look at the top, which is total assets, the bottom, which is the shareholders' equity. And here, we can make it a bigger number by simply getting more assets and letting somebody else pay for it. So if we hold equity steady, but we add assets, now we're starting to leverage the company. And that's why it's called leverage, right? We're using other people's money in order to leverage our investment as shareholders. Sounds good, right? Why wouldn't you just have a lot of leverage? Well, the problem is, as you borrow money, you're going to sign contracts with term. And if you don't pay them back, some bad things will happen to the company, leading to financial distress, then defaults, and then perhaps even bankruptcy. So we want to be very judicious in how we utilize debt, because too much debt puts you in deep risk and possible trouble.